This woman has never contributed a single cent. She's lived off her family her whole life, a parasite clinging to others. The opposing lawyer's words sliced through the Manhattan probate courtroom like a blade designed to cut deeper than bone. I sat perfectly still in the defendant's chair, watching my own brother nod in agreement while his attorney delivered character assassination disguised as legal argument. "Face it, Evelyn," he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom with practiced contempt. "You don't belong in this fight. You're nothing here." His chuckle was loud enough for the 12-person jury to hear, calculated to sound like reasonable observation rather than deliberate humiliation. She can't even keep a steady job, and now she wants a share of our father's inheritance? Pathetic. But as I steadied my breath and clasped my hands to keep them from shaking, I felt the weight of the evidence folder in my briefcase, documents they had no idea existed, proof that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about who had been supporting whom all these years. They called me a parasite. They had no idea I was the one who'd been keeping the family alive. My name is Evelyn, 36 years old. They called me useless, dependent, a burden who never contributed anything meaningful to the family except problems and expectations. They said my voice didn't matter in family decisions because I'd never earned the right to speak at the table where real adults made real choices about real money. But what they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was how the bills got paid when Dad's construction business went under, how the mortgage stayed current when Mom was dying in that expensive hospital bed, how my brother's college tuition checks never bounced even when the family bank account showed zeros that stretched like death certificates. The Parker family brownstone in Brooklyn Heights had been our anchor for 3 generations, a 4-story monument to working-class success that my grandfather had bought with blood, sweat, and the kind of stubborn Irish determination that builds empires one brick at a time. By the time I turned 25, it was drowning in debt that threatened to pull all of us under. Our kitchen table told the story better than any family portrait. Bills spread across its surface like casualties of war, mortgage statements with red warnings, medical bills that read like ransom notes, utility notices that arrived with the regularity of death threats. The numbers were staggering: 40, 3,000 in medical debt from Mom's cancer treatment, 18,000 behind on property taxes, 12,000 in credit card bills that had kept us fed when Dad's construction contracts dried up like rain in August. I worked double shifts at Mercy General Hospital, 16 hours a day as a medical billing coordinator, a job that paid $38,000 a year and required the kind of attention to detail that kept other people's financial lives from falling apart. Ironic, considering my own family's finances were hemorrhaging faster than I could apply tourniquets. But every night, after my brothers Marcus and Tommy had finished dinner and disappeared to their rooms or their dates or their friends who didn't know what it felt like to choose between heat and groceries, I'd sit at that kitchen table with a calculator and a checkbook that held miracles I couldn't explain and shouldn't have been able to afford. The mortgage payment, $1,800, due on the 15th. Somehow, it got paid. The electric bill, $412, with a disconnection notice attached. Somehow, the lights stayed on. Mom's prescription medications, $2,000 a month that insurance wouldn't cover. Somehow, the pharmacy never turned us away. My family called it luck. They called it divine intervention. They called it everything except what it actually was. My savings account emptying one check at a time, my retirement fund vanishing to keep their inheritance intact, my future sacrifice to preserve their past. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in October when Marcus brought his fiancée home for dinner. Jessica was everything I'd never been allowed to become: a marketing executive at a Fortune 500 company, designer clothes, confidence that came from never having to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. Over dessert that I'd bought with money I'd saved by eating ramen for lunch every day that week, Marcus decided to hold court about family finances, with the authority of someone who'd never balanced a checkbook in his life. "The thing about Evelyn," he said, gesturing with his wine glass like he was conducting an orchestra of condescension, "is that she's never really figured out how to stand on her own 2 feet. Our parents enabled her too much, and now she's 36 and still living at home, still depending on family money to survive." Jessica nodded with the polite interest of someone hearing about a distant relative's addiction problems. Tommy, my younger brother who'd graduated from law school on loans I'd co-signed, chimed in with the casual cruelty that comes naturally to people who mistake privilege for wisdom. "Stop pretending you help, Evelyn," he said. his voice carrying across our kitchen with the same dismissive tone he probably used on opposing counsel in his corporate law practice. Women like you are only a burden. You take more than you give, and you always have. I stored those words in my chest like poison, feeling them settle next to all the other insults I'd swallowed over the years. The silent accusations that I was lazy, dependent, unsuccessful. The implied suggestions that I chose to live at home because I couldn't handle the responsibilities of adult life, rather than because someone had to be there to keep the family from drowning in debt they'd never acknowledge. But it was Dad's voice that kept me steady during moments like these, echoing from conversations we'd had during his final weeks when cancer was eating him alive. But his mind remained sharp as the tools he'd once used to build other people's dreams. "Don't let them silence you, sweetheart," he'd whispered during one of our late-night talks in the hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and dying hopes. Truth has its own sharpness. Sometimes it cuts slow, but it cuts deep when the time comes. He'd been right about the timing. Every check I'd signed in secret, every debt I'd erased without recognition, every sacrifice I'd made while they called me a parasite, I'd been writing a hidden history that would eventually demand to be read aloud. The folder in my bedroom closet grew thicker each month. Bank statements showing transfers from my account to theirs, canceled checks with my signature covering their expenses, loan documents bearing my name as guarantor for debts they'd accumulated and forgotten. A paper trail that told the real story of who had been supporting whom, who had been the parasite and who had been the host. For 11 years, I'd swallowed their insults and paid their bills, watching them build lives on foundations I'd provided while they dismissed me as dead weight. But every humiliation had been documented, every financial rescue recorded, every moment of their ingratitude preserved in black ink on white paper. They thought they knew the story of Evelyn Parker, the unsuccessful daughter who'd never amounted to anything, who lived off family generosity and contributed nothing but problems. They were about to learn that some stories have different endings than the ones their authors intended. The truth was patient, but it was also keeping receipts. By day, I processed medical bills at Mercy General, translating other people's pain into numbers that insurance companies could understand and hopefully pay. By night, I sat at that same kitchen table where my family counted me worthless, documenting every payment I'd made on their behalf, with the methodical precision of someone building a case that would eventually go to trial. Each entry in my ledger told a story they'd never bothered to learn. March 15th, 2019, $2,847 to Brooklyn Methodist for mom's chemotherapy copay. My signature on the check, my account number on the bank statement, my sacrifice that kept her treatments flowing when their insurance ran out. June 3rd, 2020, $4,200 to Empire State Property Management for 3 months of back rent when Dad's construction business collapsed during the pandemic. Again, my checking account bleeding out to keep their roof intact. The pattern was relentless and invisible. Every financial crisis that threatened to destroy the Parker family legacy was quietly resolved by the daughter they dismissed as a failure, the sister they treated like an unwelcome houseguest in her own childhood home. I kept copies of everything: bank statements, canceled checks, money transfer receipts, loan documents bearing my signature as guarantor for debts I'd never created but somehow inherited responsibility for. The evidence lived in a fireproof safe in my bedroom closet, organized with the kind of meticulous detail that comes from years of working in medical billing, where one missing digit can mean the difference between payment and bankruptcy. But it was the notebook that really captured the transformation happening inside me. Late at night, after Marcus and Tommy had gone to sleep in rooms I'd kept heated with payments they'd never acknowledged, I'd write observations that felt like prophecies waiting to fulfill themselves. October 12th, 2021, paid $3,400 for Tommy's bar exam fees. He celebrated by telling his friends, "I'm a deadbeat who lives off family money." One day, "This silence will thunder louder than their lies." That line had become my mantra during the 2 years since Dad's death, when family meetings about his estate had transformed from grief counseling sessions into strategy sessions, designed to minimize my involvement in decisions that would affect the rest of my life. They grew bolder as the legal proceedings approached. What had once been private dismissals became public humiliations orchestrated with the precision of military campaigns. Family dinners turned into ambushes where my contributions to household expenses were questioned, my career choices mocked, My very presence treated like charity they were generous enough to provide. Evelyn doesn't really understand business, Marcus would explain to his fiancée, his voice carrying the patient condescension of someone educating a child about adult concepts. She's never had to make real financial decisions because mom and dad always took care of everything for her. The irony was so profound it had its own gravitational pull. The brother whose law school loans I'd co-signed was explaining to his fiancée why I couldn't be trusted with financial responsibility. The brother whose credit cards I'd paid off when his spending spiraled out of control was lecturing about fiscal discipline. Tommy was worse because his cruelty came wrapped in legal terminology that made his dismissals sound like professional opinions rather than personal attacks. From an estate planning perspective, he'd say during family meetings that had become tribunals where I was defendant and he was prosecutor, Evelyn's lack of documented contributions to family wealth makes her claim on inheritance problematic. Documented contributions. The phrase haunted me because it revealed how completely they'd rewritten history to justify their greed. My contributions weren't documented because I'd been taught that family didn't keep score, that love meant giving without expectation of recognition or repayment. I'd believed that myth right up until the moment they weaponized my generosity against me. But every insult they delivered was also intelligence I could use. Every family meeting where they questioned my worthiness was also reconnaissance that revealed their strategy, their assumptions, their blind spots that would eventually become the cracks in their armor. I started recording our conversations. Not secretly. I'd learned enough about legal proceedings from Tommy's dinner table lectures to know that New York was a one-party consent state where I could record any conversation I participated in. But quietly, with the kind of preparation that turns family dinners into depositions and casual insults into admissible evidence, the USB drive in my fireproof box grew heavier each month. Bank statements showing 11 years of financial transfers from my accounts to theirs. Loan documents bearing my signature as guarantor for debts that had preserved their credit scores while destroying mine. Payment histories that revealed the real story of who had been supporting whom, who had been the parasite and who had been the host. But it was the audio recordings that would really tell the story. Hours of family conversations where Marcus and Tommy dismissed my contributions, questioned my intelligence, and mocked my life choices while sitting in a house I'd kept from foreclosure, eating food I'd bought with money they assumed came from family generosity rather than personal sacrifice. She's never really amounted to anything, Tommy's voice on my phone's audio app, crystal clear and unmistakably cruel. And now she thinks she deserves an equal share of Dad's estate? It's pathetic. Face it, Evelyn. Marcus on the recording from last Christmas dinner. His words sharp enough to cut through the festive atmosphere I'd tried to create with decorations I'd bought with overtime pay. You're 36 years old and you've never contributed anything meaningful to this family except problems and expectations. Each recording was time-stamped, each insult cataloged, each dismissal preserved for the moment when silence would no longer be survival strategy, but tactical advantage. They thought my quiet acceptance of their cruelty meant weakness. They assumed my lack of retaliation indicated agreement with their assessment of my worth. They mistook my documentation for obsession rather than preparation. But every night, as I added new entries to the ledger that would eventually become evidence, I felt something shifting inside me like tectonic plates preparing for an earthquake. The daughter who'd spent 11 years absorbing their insults was becoming someone else entirely, someone who understood that truth doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it waits in silence until the moment arrives when silence becomes the loudest sound in the room. My name was being struck from family documents, my voice dismissed in estate planning discussions, my contributions erased from the narrative they were constructing to justify my exclusion from Dad's legacy. But with each insult, my proof grew heavier, and they had no idea what kind of storm their cruelty had been building. The Manhattan probate court on Center Street looked like a temple built to worship the complexities of dead people's money. 20-foot ceilings, mahogany panels that had witnessed 3 generations of family feuds, and windows that filtered autumn light into something that felt more like judgment than illumination. I sat at the defendant's table wearing the same black dress I'd worn to Dad's funeral 18 months earlier, my hands folded in my lap around a small USB drive that contained 11 years of financial documentation. Across the aisle, Marcus and Tommy commanded a legal army that probably cost more per hour than I made in a month. 3 attorneys from Whitman, Pierce and Associates, the kind of white-shoe law firm that specialized in making inconvenient family members disappear from estate proceedings. Their lead counsel was Harrison Whitman himself, a man whose silver hair and handmade suits announced wealth with the subtlety of a billboard. He approached the bench with the confidence of someone who'd spent 40 years convincing judges that his client's desires should become legal reality, regardless of what truth might suggest. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying across the courtroom with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being listened to, "the evidence will show that Miss Evelyn Parker has lived as a dependent her entire adult life, contributing nothing to the family estate while drawing resources from relatives who worked to build the wealth she now seeks to claim." The words hit me like physical blows, each accusation landing with precision designed to reduce 36 years of sacrifice to a caricature of female failure. Behind me, I could hear the whispered conversations of courthouse observers who'd come to witness another family destroy itself over money that couldn't buy back the relationships it was costing them. Marcus leaned forward from his seat in the gallery, his eyes sharp with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching someone you've always resented finally get what you think they deserve. He'd dressed for the occasion, his best suit, the Rolex Dad had given him for law school graduation, the kind of confidence that comes from believing you're about to win something you've been denied too long. "Face it, Evelyn," he whispered, loud enough for the jury to hear, but quiet enough to sound like brotherly concern rather than calculated cruelty. "You don't belong in this fight. You're nothing here." Tommy nodded from beside him, his law degree giving weight to his agreement with assessments that would have destroyed most people's spirit. "She can't even keep a steady job," he added, his voice carrying the dismissive tone he probably used on clients who couldn't afford his retainer fees. "And now she wants a share of the inheritance?" Pathetic. Their attorneys had come prepared for war, binders full of documentation slammed onto mahogany tables with sounds like gunshots in a cathedral. Financial records showing my brother's business achievements, their property acquisitions, their investments that had grown the family wealth, while I supposedly contributed nothing but problems and expectations. But I sat quietly, my fingers steady around the small flash drive that felt heavier than all their accusations combined. 11 years of evidence compressed into 8 gigabytes of undeniable truth, waiting for the moment when silence would transform into something far more powerful than their loudest claims. Whitman continued his opening statement with the theatrical flourish of someone who'd perfected the art of character assassination disguised as legal argument. "This woman has never held a position of real responsibility, never contributed a meaningful sum to family expenses, never demonstrated the kind of fiscal discipline that would justify equal participation in an estate worth over $2 million. The laughter that rippled through the gallery felt like being flayed alive in public. My own family members, cousins, aunts, uncles who'd attended birthday parties I'd funded, and holiday dinners I'd prepared with groceries I'd bought, now sat in judgment of contributions they'd never bothered to notice when they were benefiting from them. But it was the way the jury looked at me that really captured the magnitude of this performance. 12 faces reflecting assumptions about women who live with family, who work in healthcare administration rather than high-powered corporate careers, who choose sacrifice over self-promotion. They saw exactly what Marcus and Tommy had trained them to see, a failure trying to claim success she'd never earned. "The evidence will show," Whitman continued, his voice building to a crescendo that felt rehearsed and calculated, "that Evelyn Parker is exactly what opposing counsel will try to convince you she isn't, a parasite who has lived off family resources her entire adult life and now seeks to be rewarded for that dependency." Parasite. The word hung in that courtroom air like smoke from expensive cigars, settling into the mahogany panels and marble floors with the weight of a verdict that had already been reached before any evidence was presented. But as I sat there absorbing their cruelty with the patience of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for 2 years, I felt something shifting inside me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with anticipation. They were choking on their own certainty, suffocating on assumptions that would soon be revealed as carefully constructed lies. The small USB drive in my palm contained bank statements showing transfers that had kept their inheritance intact, loan documents bearing my signature as guarantor for debts that had preserved their credit scores, payment histories that revealed the real story of who had been the parasite and who had been the host. But more than that, it contained audio recordings of family conversations where they'd mocked my contributions while sitting in rooms I'd kept heated, eating food I'd bought, discussing estate plans that excluded the person who'd made their comfortable life possible. My attorney, A public defender named Sarah Chen, who'd agreed to take the case pro bono because she understood what it meant when families weaponized generosity against the people who'd shown it, sat quietly beside me, waiting for our turn to speak. She had her own flash drive, filled with evidence that would rewrite everything this courtroom thought it knew about the Parker family dynamics. But we'd agreed to let them exhaust their ammunition first, to let them commit fully to a narrative that would soon be revealed as comprehensive fiction. The sting of their words burned like acid on exposed nerve endings. Every insult felt personal because it was personal. 11 years of sacrifice dismissed as dependency, a lifetime of putting family first reframed as selfish taking. But I waited, letting them choke on their own certainty, watching them build a case that would become their own destruction when the evidence revealed how completely they'd misunderstood who had been supporting whom, who had been giving and who had been taking, who deserved to be called a parasite and who had earned the right to inherit what they'd helped preserve. The truth was patient, but it was also ready to speak. The silence that followed Harrison Whitman's character assassination stretched like eternity in that mahogany-paneled courtroom. 12 jurors sat with expressions that ranged from pity to disdain, their faces reflecting everything Marcus and Tommy had trained them to see about the failure of a woman who'd supposedly lived off family charity her entire adult life. Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman who'd spent 23 years presiding over family disputes that revealed the worst of human nature, looked across the bench at me with eyes that had seen every variety of greed, manipulation, and betrayal that dead people's money could inspire. "Miss Parker," she said, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority that could reshape lives with a single ruling, "you've heard some serious allegations about your relationship with your family's finances. Do you have any response to these claims?" I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 11 years of documentation in the USB drive I'd carried like a talisman through months of preparation for this moment. The black dress I'd worn to Dad's funeral felt appropriate for what was about to happen. The death of every lie they'd constructed about who I was and what I'd contributed to this family. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady as the foundation Dad had taught me to build my life on. "I do." The walk to the clerk's desk felt like crossing a battlefield where the real war was about to begin. Behind me, I could hear Marcus shifting in his seat with the kind of nervous energy that comes from someone who's about to watch their carefully constructed narrative meet reality. I placed the USB drive on the mahogany surface with the gentle precision of someone handling evidence that would rewrite history. "These are the complete bank records from my personal accounts over the past 11 years, Your Honor. Every loan payment I made on their behalf. Every debt I cleared to preserve their credit scores. Every financial obligation I assumed to keep this family from losing everything they now claim I never helped build." The court clerk, a woman who'd probably seen thousands of family disputes play out in this same room, handled the drive with professional efficiency. But I caught the flicker of curiosity in her eyes as she connected it to the courtroom's projection system, the same look she might have given evidence that was about to change everything. The screen that descended from the ceiling transformed that courtroom from a place of testimony into something resembling a financial crime scene. Numbers began populating the display with mathematical precision that couldn't lie, couldn't be argued with, couldn't be dismissed as emotional manipulation or selective memory. March 15, 2019. Transfer of $2,847 from Evelyn Parker checking account to Brooklyn Methodist Hospital for chemotherapy copayment. June 3, 2020. Payment of $4,200 from Evelyn Parker savings account to Empire State Property Management for rent arrears. September 12, 2020. Co-signed loan of $12,000 for Marcus Parker Law School debt consolidation. The gasps started small, individual realizations spreading through the gallery like ripples from stones thrown into still water. But as line after line of transactions populated that screen, the sound grew into something that felt like the collective intake of breath from people witnessing a magic trick performed in reverse. Marcus's face underwent a transformation that would have been comical if it wasn't so devastating. The confident smirk that had carried him through his character assassination of me drained away like water from a broken dam, replaced by the pale complexion of someone watching their entire worldview collapse in real time. Tommy's reaction was even more visceral. The brother who dismissed my contributions as imaginary now stared at documentation that showed 11 years of his life had been subsidized by the sister he'd called a parasite. His law degree, his bar exam fees, his first apartment security deposit, all funded by the woman he'd accused of never contributing anything meaningful to family finances. Harrison Whitman, the silver-haired attorney who'd spent 40 years making inconvenient family members disappear from estate proceedings, now watched his case evaporate with each transaction that appeared on screen. Papers slipped from his manicured hands like leaves from a dying tree, fluttering to the marble floor with sounds like whispered confessions. But it was the audio component that really drove the knife home. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying across that suddenly quiet courtroom, "I'd also like the court to hear recordings of family conversations from the past 2 years, where my brothers discuss my supposed lack of contribution while sitting in rooms I'd paid to keep heated, eating food I'd bought with money they assumed came from family generosity." The first recording began playing through the courtroom speakers with crystalline clarity that made every cruel word sound like it was being spoken fresh. Marcus's voice, discussing my pathetic attempts to claim inheritance while benefiting from mortgage payments I'd made to keep the family home from foreclosure. A cousin in the gallery covered her mouth with hands that trembled, her eyes wide with the recognition that she'd been witnessing systematic emotional abuse, disguised as family dynamics. Other relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, probably remembering their own participation in conversations that had dismissed my contributions while benefiting from them. The silence that settled over that courtroom wasn't the comfortable quiet of successful legal proceedings. It was the profound stillness that comes when fundamental assumptions are stripped away and replaced with uncomfortable truths that can't be argued with, dismissed, or explained away. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her eyes moving between the screen full of financial evidence and the brothers who'd spent the morning explaining why their sister didn't deserve equal treatment in estate proceedings. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice carrying the kind of judicial authority that suggests the tide has turned decisively, "I'm looking at 11 years of documented financial support flowing from your opposing party to your clients. How do you reconcile these records with your claims about Miss Parker's lack of contribution to family wealth?" The question hung in that mahogany-lined air like smoke from expensive cigars, but this time the smoke was clearing to reveal truths that had been hidden for over a decade. Marcus and Tommy sat frozen in their seats like defendants awaiting sentencing, their expensive lawyers suddenly looking like people who'd walked into the wrong courtroom and found themselves defending the indefensible. The woman they'd called a parasite had just proven she was the one who'd been keeping the entire family alive. And the evidence was only getting started. The evidence lingered in the courtroom air like smoke that refused to clear, each transaction projected on the screen driving another nail into the coffin of every lie Marcus and Tommy had built about me. Harrison Whitman sat slumped at his mahogany table, no longer the commanding general but an old man watching his army surrender. His silver hair looked merely aged, his expensive suit no longer disguising that his 40-year career had just collided with a case that couldn't be undone by theatrics or character assassination. Judge Morrison studied the screen filled with financial proof, then turned her eyes to the brothers who had spent the morning insisting I was unworthy. The silence stretched tight, ready to snap. It was Marcus who broke first. "Evelyn." His voice cracked like ice under pressure. The confidence he carried into this courtroom crumbled into something closer to confession. "We didn't know. We never realized." Tommy rushed in, scrambling to contain the damage. "If we had understood the extent of your contributions, we would have handled this differently." Contributions. Even now, with 11 years of statements proving I had kept their lives afloat, he still couldn't say sacrifice, generosity, or support. But it was their eyes that betrayed the truth. These were the same brothers who had once looked me in the face while dismantling my worth, yet now they stared at their hands, their shoes, anywhere but at the sister who had just exposed them as the true parasites. I rose slowly, the weight of 11 years of silence transforming into justice. The black dress I had worn at Dad's funeral now carried the authority of a verdict written in undeniable proof. "Marcus, Tommy, look at me." The command in my voice surprised even me. I was no longer the woman who swallowed their insults to keep peace. I was someone who had learned that sometimes truth must be shouted to cut through the noise of lies. They lifted their eyes reluctantly, like defendants awaiting sentence. And in that moment, I saw what they finally understood, that the balance of power in our family had shifted forever. "The years you mocked me as dependent," I said, my words as sharp as the numbers glowing behind me, "were the years I was keeping you from losing everything." The nights you laughed at my failures were the nights I was paying the bills that preserved your success. The gallery was silent. Everyone recognized they were witnessing something unforgettable the moment cruelty collided with evidence and lost. Every family dinner where you questioned my worth was funded by money I transferred to your accounts. Every estate meeting where you dismissed me was held in a house I saved from foreclosure. Judge Morrison leaned forward, now clearly aligned with fact over fiction. The jurors who had looked at me with pity 90 minutes earlier now wore expressions of respect and shame. Today, I continued, my voice resonant, the truth speaks at last. And it says the ones who called me dependent were the very people who depended on me to survive. The reversal was complete. The brothers who had branded me a parasite had been revealed as the ones feeding on my sacrifice. Marcus tried once more, his voice barely audible. Evelyn, we're family. We can work this out privately, without all this public spectacle. But I was done with privacy that shielded their comfort and buried my dignity. Done with loyalty that only flowed one way. Done with silence that protected their cruelty while erasing my worth. Yes, we are family, I said, each word landing like the strike of a gavel. That's why I spent 11 years sacrificing my future to preserve yours. But family doesn't just take, it acknowledges. Family doesn't just benefit, it recognizes. And family does not call the one keeping it alive a parasite. The courtroom settled into a silence unlike before, not shock, but the deep stillness that comes when truth has been spoken so clearly that denial is impossible. Heads bowed across the room, relatives who had dismissed me, lawyers whose case had just collapsed, jurors who had nearly condemned someone who had proven herself far more generous than they had imagined. Respect filled the chamber, reluctant but undeniable. Not admiration for achievement, but recognition of injustice finally corrected by truth that refused to stay hidden. The woman they had called a parasite had just proven she was the one keeping everyone alive. And the evidence was still speaking. Judge Patricia Morrison raised her gavel with the precision of someone who had spent 23 years turning messy family feuds into legal clarity. When it struck the bench, the sound echoed through the mahogany-paneled courtroom like thunder, marking the end of an 11-year storm. The evidence presented is indisputable, she declared, her voice cutting through the silence with authority backed by documents that could not lie. Miss Evelyn Parker has demonstrated substantial financial contributions to the preservation of this estate. Her claim to equal inheritance is not only valid but legally compelling. The words landed on Marcus and Tommy like blows. Hours earlier they had painted me as worthless. Now their own attorneys looked as though they had wandered into the wrong courtroom. The gallery shifted uneasily. Family members who had dismissed me for years wore faces of shame and disbelief. My cousin Patricia, once laughing at Marcus's jokes about my pathetic claim, now covered her trembling mouth. Uncle Robert stared at the floor, weighed down by his own complicity. Harrison Whitman, their high-priced lawyer, made a final desperate attempt. Your Honor, perhaps a brief recess to discuss settlement. But Judge Morrison cut him off. Mr. Whitman, your clients have spent considerable time arguing that Miss Parker lacks standing. The evidence proves otherwise. The estate will be divided equally among all legitimate heirs, including Miss Parker, effective immediately. I rose slowly, vindication settling over me like armor earned through years of sacrifice. The small USB drive that had carried 11 years of records felt heavier than all their accusations, combined a reminder that truth doesn't always shout, but waits patiently until silence itself becomes deafening. Walking toward the exit felt like crossing a battlefield where the war had been won, not with force but with facts too solid to be twisted. Behind me, whispers rippled as people processed what they had just witnessed. The systematic dismantling of lies disguised as family dynamics. Marcus called out, his voice raw with desperation. Evelyn, wait. We're still family. We can work this out. I turned. This was the same brother who had mocked my failures while enjoying the life I paid for, who had questioned my worth inside homes kept warm by my silent contributions. Now he looked small, like a man begging forgiveness from the very person he had scorned. We are family, Marcus, I said, my voice calm but final. But family means recognizing sacrifice, not exploiting it. It means acknowledging contributions, not dismissing them. It means calling generosity by its true name, instead of twisting it into dependency. The courtroom doors opened, spilling autumn sunlight across the marble floor. The city outside pulsed with taxis, footsteps, and noise, A reminder that life went on, unconcerned with inheritance disputes or family betrayals. As I stepped into that light, I thought of the woman who had entered 6 hours earlier, bracing herself to fight for equality in a family that had erased her role. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's the quiet accumulation of evidence, compounding like interest until the moment arrives when truth can no longer be ignored. That tiny USB drive, small enough to hide in my palm, had shattered 11 years of lies. 8 gigabytes had rewritten who I was, what I had given, and who truly deserved to be called a parasite. They thought my silence was weakness, I whispered as I descended the courthouse steps. They never saw it was my weapon. The evidence had spoken with mathematical precision. The truth had risen with a voice no jury or lawyer could dismiss. The woman once branded dependent had just proven that everyone else had been depending on her, and I had learned something vital. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Sometimes it is justice documented, evidence gathered, truth sharpened until it speaks with a voice that cruelty cannot silence. I had won more than inheritance rights. I had won the right to be seen clearly, valued properly, and never again dismissed as unworthy. The truth had set me free, and freedom, I realized as I walked into the autumn air, tasted exactly like vindication served at the perfect moment. If Evelyn's story reminded you that documenting your contributions isn't paranoia, it's protection, hit that like button and let me know in the comments which part of her journey resonated most with you. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week, we're diving into another story about quiet strength creating explosive vindication. We're exploring the unsuccessful daughter who was written out of her family's business, and how she built a competing empire that put them out of business entirely. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't fighting back immediately. It's staying quiet while you build a case that speaks so loudly they can't ignore it. Until next time, keep receipts, not because you're planning revenge, but because truth backed by evidence is the only language that bullies in business suits actually understand. The woman they called a parasite just proved she was keeping everyone alive. Now it's your turn to show them who's really been holding the family together.